Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Mark Whitaker, the author of Saying It Loud, 1966, the year Black Power challenged the Civil Rights Movement. He's now written 3 books and is a contributor to CBS Sunday Morning. He also ran CNN Worldwide and was the editor of Newsweek. And indeed, as a devoted subscriber in the late 90s, I remember reading his welcome messages as I sat on the New York City subway on my way to school every week. It's a pleasure to welcome Mark Whitaker to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. In some ways, it seems like a miracle. The Civil Rights Movement, as directed by Martin Luther King Jr., was all about nonviolence. Take the beatings with a clenched jaw. Deal with the spit and the mustard being thrown at them and the fire hoses. Deal with those things with signs and with chants. Respond to fire bombings with speeches. Demand the right to vote, but never punch back. But in 1966, the groundwork was laid for a new kind of campaign. The question was, could true gains be made nonviolently? Before we get to that, though, I want to ask Mark, if I may call you Mark, for modern readers who didn't grow up during the Civil Rights Movement, how should we understand the term Black Power?
Well, the Civil Rights Movement before 1966, which is really the focus of my book, Everything That Happened That Year, was characterized by a couple of things, at least for the previous decade, starting with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, 1966. One, as you mentioned, was seeking change through nonviolent protests, marches, and, songs and so forth and so on. Also, the objectives were primarily focused on legislation, leading eventually to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ended sort of public segregation, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And the leadership, there were other leaders involved, but really Martin Luther King Jr. was identified both within the Black community, outside the Black community, as a leader of that phase. So in 1966, a number of things happened, all kind of loosely under the rubric of Black Power. One is you have a younger generation, and we can talk about some of their characteristics, which started to question, one, whether the movement should be unconditionally nonviolent. 2, whether the whole project of integration, the idea that the ultimate goal was a society where Blacks and whites kind of, forgot about racial differences and lived together peaceably, whether that was attainable or even desirable. And then also sort of politically, whether legislation was enough, whether Blacks needed to take it a step further in using their newfound right to vote, to organize, to form their own Black parties, to elect their own Black officials, to focus on other issues such as housing, jobs, police, and so forth. So, we can talk about how the chant itself became popular, but those broadly
I did have a question about that, but yeah.
The differences that emerged in 1966.
In the introduction to your book, you say that the roots of nonviolence can sort of be found, at least intellectually, in the quote from Booker T. Washington, who said in the 1880s, certainly as Jim Crow was rising, that brains, prosperity, and character for the Negro, and I'm using quotes around that, that's what he said, will settle the question of civil rights. Brains, prosperity, and character will settle the question of civil rights. I'm just curious to have you explain the Tuskegee Institute and how that quote and then the Institute laid the groundwork for the approach taken by the 1960s civil rights leaders pre-Black Power?
Well, Booker T. Washington, he represented one strain of thought, which was fundamentally that the way for blacks to get ahead was not necessarily to challenge the white power structure. It was to sort of form an alternative sort of universe where blacks, would go to black-run schools, what became known as historically black colleges and universities, seek training and professions sort of within the Black community, become doctors, lawyers, businessmen serving other Black folks, but not necessarily with sort of demanding that white society change. And he founded the Tuskegee Institute, later become Tuskegee University, sort of on these principles. And, obviously there were many other distinguished HBCUs, but I think partly because he was the founder, partly because they became associated with the great Tuskegee Airmen of World War II, that institution was considered sort of like the center and the ultimate example of that approach to civil rights. But by the 60s and even the 50s, there were leaders who were saying we shouldn't just settle for having opportunities within Black America. We need to demand, a more equal society across the board.
It's really easy, at least I think, to get lost in some of the generalities about what African Americans and Blacks were up against when you look at it from the scope of 100 years ago, or in the case of the civil rights movement, 60, 70, 80 years ago. I want to have you explain what Black Americans were up against. And one of the key counties in your book is Lowndes. I'm not sure how to say it. Lowndes County, in Alabama. County. Yeah.
Yep.
You say not a single Black person, not one, had cast a vote there in 60 years. Can you explain as much as you can in the time we have here to just explain how Jim Crow worked to keep that system up?
Well, obviously conditions for Blacks varied in different parts of the country, and throughout the 20th century, starting around the time of World War I, all the way until, after World War II and into the 60s, 6 million Black folks migrated from the South to the North to escape the conditions there, Jim Crow and so forth. Now, what they found in the North was better, but not as, it was actually turned out to be in many ways, much less opportunity than they had hoped when they got there. And we can talk about that later. But in the South, which is interesting because, after the Civil War, after emancipation in 1965, there was this brief period that was called Reconstruction, where Blacks were now free. They had the right to vote. They elected officials to all the way up to Congress in Washington and at the local level. And then there was a backlash against the progress made during Reconstruction that produced Jim Crow. And in many ways, things got just as bad, almost as bad as, and in some ways worse than they had been even under slavery, in the sense that Blacks were free, but there was, a kind of level of violence directed against Black people, particularly by the Ku Klux Klan, starting in the late 20th century and into the 21st century, that in some ways was even more extreme. You had lynchings and so forth on a regular basis. And the other part of Jim Crow was all of these provisions that were put in place across the South to keep blacks from voting, right? So rather than just outright say blacks didn't have the right to vote, although that existed too, there were tests that blacks had to take in order to be able to register. For example, you had to be able to recite the entire Constitution. Well, most white people couldn't do that. You had
I'm
to
not
pay.
sure anybody can do that. But okay.
You had to pay, poll taxes to vote that black folks couldn't afford. So Lowndes County, which was this very, area in sort of the Cotton Belt, the part of the South, where whites had controlled all the land and under slavery, blacks had picked cotton. After the Civil War, most of those blacks couldn't afford their own land and weren't able to buy it, so they became what were called sharecroppers, where they would stay on land owned by whites, producing and have to sort of at least half of what they produced had to be turned over to the landowner in rent, and then the rest they could sell. It was a very impoverished existence. And meanwhile, because of all these, voter, provisions that were put in place to keep them from voting, in Lowndes County, over 80% of the population was black. And yet whites owned, almost all the land, and none of those black folks had been allowed to vote, as I said, in 60 years. That was what, even before 1966, and then when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, this, organization of young blacks that was formed in the early 60s, their big project was to go into the Deep South, to places like Lowndes County, and to register black folks to vote. And that was so dangerous. They were attacked by the Ku Klux Klan, by night riders. It was incredibly dangerous work because there was just a fierce resistance on the part of the white population.
Who is Stokely Carmichal, and how did this kid who went to high school in the Bronx, less than a mile from where I grew up, I could see it from my windows, Bronx High School of Science. Who is Stokely Carmichal? How did a kid who went to high school in the Bronx wind up in rural Mississippi chanting Black Power?
Yeah. Well, okay. So Stokely Carmichal, as you said, he was born in the Caribbean, lived with his grandmother and aunts when he was young. At age 11, he came to America to join his parents, who had moved here earlier. They lived in the Bronx. His father eventually scraped together enough money to buy a rundown house in the North Bronx in a white neighborhood. So in his teens, Stokely lived in a white neighborhood and went to the Bronx High School of Science, for anybody who knows, a kind of a sort of a magnet school for really talented kids from across
I didn't get in there. I got into Brooklyn Tech. I didn't get into Bronx Science.
There you go. Still exists today. And then to Howard University, which was probably, the premier historically black college then and now. And while he was at Howard, he became involved in the civil rights movement and activism, and he joined SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was this group of young, basically formed by students in the early 60s. And as I said, their initial project really was to go into the Deep South to register black folks to vote. And so he started doing that while he was at Howard, and then in the years afterwards. And starting in 1965 and into 1966, he actually became the field organizer, the head of SNCC operations in Lowndes County. And so what he was trying to do in Lowndes County was not just register black folks to vote, but then get them to form their own political party so they could elect their own candidates to office.
And the theory was that they could go to places where there were majority black populations and say, hey, wait a minute, you have no political power, but if we can get people registered to vote, and if they can safely vote, then they'll go from no power to having significant power and control.
Well, and then it needed to be, you put it very well, but that it also needed to be more than just having the right to vote, because, for example, Lowndes County was in Alabama. Now, Alabama was totally controlled at the time by a Democratic Party that was segregationist, white supremacist. Their slogan was white supremacy for the right. The governor of Alabama was George Wallace, who was probably the best known segregationist in the country at the time. So Stokely's point was it wasn't enough just for blacks to have the right to vote so that they could turn around and vote for George Wallace. They had to have black, candidates to vote for, and the only way to get black candidates to vote for was to form their own political party, and that's what he tried to do in Lowndes County. So when you talk about what did Black Power mean, first Stokely in the spring of 1966, in what was actually sort of a surprise development, became the chairman of SNCC, deposing John Lewis, who we all remember as the great beloved congressman. He had been the chairman of the top position at SNCC for several years. He expected to get reelected at a retreat where they would have a leadership vote. But after winning a first ballot, there was a challenge to that result, and it resulted in this wild all-night meeting, which there's a whole chapter in the book about, that ends with the vote being reversed, and this time Stokely wins. And partly because there was a faction within SNCC among these young students that had become more militant and thought that essentially that John Lewis was too moderate. So first he becomes the chairman of SNCC. And at that point, very few people in the national press even knew who he was. So that was the first thing that kind of put him on the map. And then just shortly afterwards, in the middle of a march across Mississippi to organize Black folks called the Meredith March, which was sort of like, a sequel to the famous Selma to Montgomery March in Alabama the year before. Stokely Carmichal at a nighttime rally starts chanting Black Power. Now, when he does that, first of all, that chant took off like wildfire. All of a sudden, everybody was talking about Black Power. What does it mean? Et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, in other words, it was carried in the media and
newspapers. The stories. Yeah. There was a story that nighttime rally in Greenwood, Mississippi. There was an Associated Press story about it, and in the headline it said, "Blacks shout Black Power." That Associated Press story was picked up the next day and over the weekend. It was a Thursday night, by over 200 newspapers across the country. So all of a sudden, people are picking up their newspapers around America, reading about Black people shouting Black Power. And just a few days later, on that Sunday, Stokely Carmichal was booked on Face the Nation on CBS, flown to Washington to be the guest. Newsweek, where I used to work, runs a big story. Time magazine runs a big story. Everybody's talking about Black Power. Now, people read all kinds of things into that. A lot of, in the press coverage, there was a lot of, well, does this mean armed revolution? Does it mean anti-white? But for Stokely, what it meant, and he didn't necessarily always do a great job in explaining it when given the opportunity, but at the time, at the very beginning there, what he was talking about more than anything was this what he was trying to do in Lowndes County. He was talking about political power, organizing Blacks, now that they had the vote, to use their political clout.
baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
I'm curious what was happening in the nonviolent sort of sector, if you will. That's not a great word, but on the nonviolent, the more traditional civil rights movement, as I guess you're taught in high school. By 1966, there had been gains made. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act was signed in 1965. What were Dr. King and his followers fighting for at that point, and then how did they react to this sort of, I don't know, alternative is the right word, but this sort of new offshoot of this original civil rights movement?
Well, I have 3 chapters in the book about that. 2 of them are about Dr. King trying to take the civil rights movement, his version of the civil rights movement, to Chicago. So by late 1965, he had decided that it was time, all the great battles of the previous 10 years had been fought in the South, in Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma. He decided it was time to try to expand the civil rights movement, take it to the North, and also to expand what was being pushed for to housing, jobs, but mostly housing.
And Chicago, because it had such a history of segregation.
There was a large Black population that had started to move there in the early days of the Great Migration. Obviously, it was after New York, at the time. I think still the second biggest city in America. So there was guaranteed to be a lot of press coverage of whatever they did. The mayor, Richard Daley, was someone who King thought he, might be difficult to deal with, but it had such a grip on the city that any agreements that they might reach could be enforced by Mayor Daley. So anyway, he announces that he's going to open this front in Chicago, that he goes so far as to rent an apartment on the West Side, a very, poor Black neighborhood in the city, and live there part-time for the rest of the year. But what eventually happens is that there are 2 phases. First, in the spring, he moves into the slum apartment and he tries to draw attention to the impoverished slum conditions that Blacks are living in on the west side of Chicago, and thinking that he can identify the sort of evil slumlords as villains. And in fact, it turned out that it was harder to find those kind of stereotypical bad guys, at least compared with what he had the kind of people he had confronted in the South. So then later on in the year, he shifts the focus to going into white neighborhoods where Blacks were being denied the right to buy homes in Chicago. And when that happens, all hell breaks loose. Thousands of white Chicago, working class residents turn out in the streets to as King and his supporters are trying to march through these neighborhoods, pelting them with rocks and bottles and racist taunts. King himself gets struck in the head with a rock. He later says this is as terrifying as anything he had ever seen in the South. So ultimately, there was a kind of a face-saving deal that was cut with Mayor Daley so that both sides could kind of claim victory, but all it really did was to, commit to a study to study all of these problems. Anyway, the point was that as there was all of this new activity on the sort of more militant new Black Power wing of the Black movement, young people were looking at what was happening to King in Chicago and saying, see, we were right. Even Dr. King is not having the success that he used to once he tries to, take the movement, his version of the movement further. The other thing, just very briefly, that happened that year that was also very disillusioning to this new, more militant generation was in Georgia, Julian Bond. Who,
that was actually my next question. You went into it beautifully.
So ask the question and then I'll respond.
Well, the question was just, how did Julian Bond and what happened to him start to make people realize that the arc of justice was bending too slowly?
Yeah. So the other thing that sort of happened on kind of like the old the old playbook not working anymore was that Julian Bond, who had been another early SNCC volunteer, he had run the communications department for several years. In 1965, he runs for the state legislature in a district in Atlanta, and he wins the race. So he's all set to be sworn in as a state representative. Now, SNCC became the first civil rights organization to come out against the Vietnam War in very early January 1966. It was not a decision that Bond was involved in, but after they issued this statement against the war, a local radio reporter in Atlanta called him, who he had dealt with on other stories, called him and said, what position, do you support this statement on the war? And he said he did. And then the reporter said, well, what about all these people who are starting to burn their draft cards? And he said, well, it's not something I would do myself, but I support someone who, if they truly, they're truly acting out of conviction, would do that and would be willing to suffer the consequences. Well, this was not only reported on the radio, but then as soon as that radio report came out, it was picked up by all the local newspapers. A lot of the context was stripped out. So it sort of, the stories made Bond look like he was condoning draft card burning. And then literally within a couple of days, the white legislators organize to decide that they're going to deny him his seat. So he shows up on the first session of the state legislature, and while everybody else is being sworn in, he's told he has to sit down. He can't be sworn in. Then they have sort of a trial, essentially a hearing where he's put on trial for his statements, and the state legislature votes to deny him his seat. And so he contests that, he runs again, he wins the seat again in a special election. He eventually takes the case to the Supreme Court, and in the end of 1966, he wins a unanimous ruling by the Warren Court. And so he's eventually seated, but again, for a lot of young Blacks of his generation, they looked at that and said, what's the point of playing by the rules? You say we should try to, accomplish our goals working within the sort of traditional two-party system. Well, look at what it gets you when you look at what happened to Julian Bond.
Before we get back to the narrative of this a little bit, I want to ask you a couple of questions just about your process here. What sources did you use to put this narrative together?
Well, there obviously I did a lot of reporting. A lot of the people who I write about are no longer with us, but to the degree that there were people who are still around that I could talk to. I interviewed as many of them as I could. It's recent enough that there are a fair number of oral histories. So in previous eras, people would have relied on letters and correspondence, and there was some of that with these folks, but even more valuable were various oral histories, interviews that had been done of them while they were still alive. So even though I couldn't interview the ones who had passed, I could listen to their voices and their accounts of these things in oral histories. A number of the major figures, Stokely Carmichal, the founders of the Black Panthers, who we can talk about, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, and others wrote autobiographies, which were valuable, except you had to be really careful about whether you could trust their accounts of events.
Yeah.
They often tended to be quite self-serving or selective. So I obviously read all of those, but I tried to, whenever possible, independently come out with independent substantiation.
It sounds like you read a lot of newspapers. It sounds like.
And then of course all the newspaper accounts of everything that happened were incredibly valuable. And luckily, not all, but most of the publications that had reporters covering all of the events of that year are archived. Sometimes you still have to. I did a lot of the work on this book during the pandemic, and in the past I might not have been able to get to those archives because they were buried in libraries, but a lot of them thankfully have been digitized. And there were also some smaller publications that only really existed that were formed by either young students or activists that didn't survive for that long, but did very good coverage of some of the events. There was and I was able to track those down and rely on them as well.
I know it's not always easy for a journalist to talk about themselves. You and I are probably have aversions to that, but I do want to ask, how did this flow from your other books? You've written a memoir, and then you also wrote a book about the history of Pittsburgh and Black Pittsburgh in the first half of the 20th century. So did you feel a natural flow from your memoir?
Yeah, that's
and
a very
that
good question.
I
guess what I have found myself being fascinated by are these sort of turning points in Black history that involve a cast of characters that are not purely just biographies or books about the exploits of one or two people, and that where there is sort of that where you can kind of tell a story of sort of a turning point in Black history, both politically and culturally. So even though my previous book, Smoketown, was about Pittsburgh, it was really the story of Black America in the era of the Great Migration before the Civil Rights Movement. So it's a story of a community of people who had come largely from the South, had moved to this northern city, who were still living in largely segregated conditions, and with limited opportunities, but created a kind of a world and a culture onto themselves, which actually ended up being very influential across Black America, not just in Pittsburgh. The leading Black newspaper at the time, the Pittsburgh Courier, came out of Pittsburgh. All of these great jazz musicians, two of the greatest Negro League teams of the 1930s, August Wilson, the great playwright, came out of Pittsburgh. So uh, and the other people had written parts of that story, but nobody had really connected all of those dots. And so, having done that, and that story really ends in the late 50s and early 60s. Having done that, I wanted to do a book about the next phase in Black history, which was the civil rights movement. But honestly, so much had been done about Dr. King and about, this, what they call the golden era of the civil rights movement that I talked about, those 10 years before 1966. But then, as I was doing my research about all of that, I realized that all of these things that had happened all of a sudden to change the conversation in 1966, and nobody had really connected the dots that all these things happened in that one year. So that sort of, it was a way. In the first instance, I kind of like the organizing principle was the city, and in this case, it was the organizing principle was the year.
I'm curious. I guess back to our narrative. I'm curious. There were political demands that were clearly being made, but there were also cultural demands, and I was very interested to hear in your book about how 1966 became the year that the word, and I'm going to say it, that the word Negro began to feel antiquated, because you always see, like at the beginning of your book, it happens where they say, I included the word Negro because it was the way they spoke in those days. And when I quote people, I leave that word in there. But you never really hear when that word sort of went out of fashion. And it turns out it was 1966. So why? What happened?
Well, I think it was, again, so as you say, there was, the political dimension of Black power, but then there was this cultural dimension, which really had to do with just a greater expression of pride in being Black, in Black ancestry, in Black history, and not sort of accepting the labels that white America had put on Black people. So there, so as you said, this is the first, the term Negro persisted. It didn't completely go away in 1966, but that was the year when, in significant numbers, people started to protest that label, to say, we don't like that label. It's a label that white people use for us. We don't like it. We choose to call ourselves something different, and that was Black. It later became African American, but that didn't happen until the 80s. Black, what was we now know as the Afro, and at that time it was called the natural look, took off. And again, that was the idea, like, what are we doing, spending all this time straightening our hair? We're just trying to look white. Our natural hair is curly. Let's celebrate our natural hair. People started wearing what these African tunics known as dashikis as an expression of their connection with Africa. And, this is very much in the news today, but Black Studies, actually the first call for a Black Studies program on a white campus was also 1966 at San Francisco State. So as I write in the book, you had, all of these different political, SNCC becoming more militant, the Black Panthers being formed in Oakland, California, some of these setbacks for Dr. King and the old civil rights movement. And then in the midst of all of this, you have this kind of cultural awakening. And again, all in the same year.
Yeah. Speaking of the culture wars, you also say this was the year that the concept of white resentment became a political force, and the roots of Richard Nixon's victories and Ronald Reagan's eventual victories can be found in this year as well. And, there was one quote in the book, it was almost hard to read. They're asking for too much at once. They should try the installment plan.
Right.
That was a tough quote to read, but you
Yeah.
say it's telling as to why we eventually saw the rise of Richard Nixon and then eventually to the presidential level, Ronald Reagan.
So, it's really interesting because, in choosing, I chose 1966 partly because once I was doing my research and reporting, I discovered that so much happened in that one year. But also, I had not realized, and really there has not been that much written about it, how much of a turning point year that was just for American politics in general. And in 1964, Lyndon Johnson, after John F. Kennedy's assassination, he had been Kennedy's vice president. He runs for the presidency himself, and he wins in a historic landslide against Barry Goldwater, who is and it's huge electoral college and popular vote victory. The Democrats, have a commanding control of both the House and the Senate. And there were a lot of people after 1964, Goldwater is dismissed by a lot of people as an extremist. And there were a lot of people after 1964 saying that it's going to take a generation for the Republicans to recover. Well, what happens just 2 years later? The Republicans have a big midterm election. They pick up a bunch of seats in the House, a lot of, a number of state houses, including California, where Ronald Reagan is elected governor for the first time. Even in the South, which was still controlled by Democrats, an even more extreme segregationist Lester Maddox is elected in Georgia. George Wallace, who was term limited and couldn't run, had his wife run in his place, a complete novice, Lurleen Wallace, and she wins in a huge landslide. And what the pundits were saying at the time, and which clearly was documented in a lot of the polling data when I examined it, was that what was driving this rightward swing was a backlash against this new kind of mood of militancy in the Black community. Both the slogan Black Power, the figure of Stokely Carmichal and some of the other more militant leaders, and also the fact that for really the third year in a row, there were significant urban riots in 1966 during the summer. There had been one in Harlem in 1964, in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles in 1965. In 1966, it spreads to Chicago, to Atlanta, to San Francisco. So there was also a backlash against that. And as you say, when you think about what happened with conservative and Republican politics after that, it's, Richard Nixon sees all this, thinks that maybe he still has a shot at running again for president, which he does and wins in 1968. Reagan, having been elected as governor in 1966, serves 2 terms as governor and then becomes the next great leader of the Republican Party. And in some ways, Wallace, who remained a Democrat, ran in 1968, sort of as a third party candidate. A lot of sort of the kind of white grievance politics that he stood for, some people would say, is a big part of the Trump phenomenon today. So you can kind of see the seeds of sort of conservative politics in America for the next 60 years right there in 1966.
What short-term achievements did the movement make?
Did the Black Power movement,
right?
As opposed to the civil rights,
right?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question, because I think that the short answer is not much, and I think people who view that the turn in sort of the way in which Black Power changed the conversation that's the first thing they would point to. They would say, look, until 1966, it wasn't perfect, but blacks were making progress. The legislation we talked about, 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act. There was a third Civil Rights Act proposed by President Johnson in 1966 that would have addressed housing and some other issues, enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. And when Stokely Carmichal took over SNCC and kind of was making all of these more militant noises, there were more conservative black leaders like Roy Wilkins, who was the head of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, who were saying, this is a problem because all of this more militant talk is going to undermine the prospects of passing this third civil rights bill. And sure enough, that bill goes down to defeat. By the end of 1966. So certainly in the short term, there was not the kind of real concrete gains to be shown. However, what I will say is, and look, I also think that, a lot of the rhetoric and the posturing of Carmichael and the Panthers, and particularly Eldridge Cleaver once he joined the Panthers on the West Coast, did not necessarily were not necessarily productive. However, there were some things that, in terms of just their analysis, I think the Black Power generation was on to. So we talked earlier about this idea of blacks. It's not just enough for blacks to get the right to vote. They have to organize and use their political clout in places where they are in a majority, or they have, a decisive, percentage of the population. Well, the project of creating entirely black parties didn't really go that far. But that model, that idea, becomes the basis in the coming years for electing black mayors in cities where blacks had become, a majority of the population, congressional districts leading to the Congressional Black Caucus, and so forth. And all of that really over time starts to transform American politics. And then the other thing that the Black Power generation was talking about was policing. And the original project really of the Black Panther Party, on the West Coast, formed in October of 1966 with, the berets and the leather jackets and the guns that everybody remembers. They soon became, largely under the influence of Eldridge Cleaver, sort of veered off into talking about armed revolution and so forth, which, was never going to happen. But their initial idea was that they were going to form civilian patrols that would go around not confronting the police, but keeping an eye on the police, and just, ride around. If they saw police interacting with, young blacks or whatever in Oakland, they would get out of the car and just stand there just so the cops knew that somebody was watching them, right? And again, when you think about all of these kind of, this seemingly endless cycle of these awful incidents involving unarmed blacks who are, end up dead, because of interactions with the police. Why do we know about those today? We know about them because of cell phones. We know about them because of body, so that technology did not exist. So the idea of civilian patrols, in these black neighborhoods, was not a crazy idea. But then, once Huey Newton decided that he wanted, to go around with guns, that was just asking for trouble, both in terms of the perception of it, but then also the potential for incidents that escalated and ended up, with people dead.
All right, I got a couple more for you. How
Yeah.
should we be teaching the history of Black Power and the Black Power movement in schools for young people?
Well, I think it's just, I look, I would teach it, this is my bias as a journalist, in the way that I tried to present it in the book, which was not to take sides, not to romanticize the Black Power leaders, but not to, condemn them either, and to just point out, all the forces that were at play. There were, what are now called, systemic racist, dynamics that were very much at play. But there are also organizational dynamics in terms of the different groups and their rivalries and so forth. There were generational dynamics between younger Blacks and older Jacks. There were regional dynamics between, the South and the North. And there were personality dynamics having to do with both the strengths and the weaknesses of all these personalities. And to me, all of that is history. History is not, both in terms of understanding what really happened, but then even also in terms of drawing lessons for the present. You need to look at all of that.
If it's not taught, what will we lose?
Well, I think, first of all, we'll lose a real understanding of the history, and it makes it easier for either people will be ignorant or the people who want to present, a one-sided view of the history for one reason or another, will, have a monopoly on what we know about this era. But also, I think, and particularly, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post when there was this whole controversy about the new advanced placement course for African American history in Florida, is that, teaching history, particularly at the high school level in America, has always had a civic as well as an educational purpose, which is to say that it prepares you to be a better citizen, to know our history, right? And if we are going to live and get along and continue to be a functional democracy in a country where we have the kind of diversity that we have now, racial and ethnic and other kinds of diversity, I think in order to make everybody feel invested in being American citizens, we have to allow a teaching of history where everybody gets to see the role that they played and people like them played in the history.
I love asking authors about their dedication pages. So I want to ask you, who are C. Sylvester Whitaker Jr. and Jean Tice Whitaker?
Those are my parents.
And you dedicated the book to them?
Both are both gone, sadly. My parents married. They were an interracial couple. They married in the 1950s when that was still illegal in many states. It was not a particularly long or happy marriage. They ended up divorcing when I was 6 years old. My brother and I lived with my mother, went to live with my mother. My father sort of dropped out of our lives for a while, but then reemerged, not in 1966, but a couple of years later as the first head of African American Studies at Princeton University. He was, both my parents were college professors. So long before I was 12 years old at the time, long before I ever knew that I would write a book about Black Power, I think the fact that my father, all of a sudden he's back in my life and he's grown an afro and he's wearing a daishiki and he teaches me the Black Power handshake and he's head of African American Studies. I think I probably, explain some of my fascination with this period. And as I say in the dedication, it was really from my father that, obviously, my Black identity and my knowledge of Black history and of Africa, that was his specialty, comes from that. But my mother did two things. One is she always encouraged my writing. And the other thing, which I will always be eternally grateful for, was that, even after the divorce, she went out of her way to keep my brother and me in contact with my father's family. with my grandparents, my aunts and uncles on that side of the family. Most of them were still in Pittsburgh, where my father had grown up. We were living in Massachusetts, south of Boston, but my mother would, take us every year during Christmas time, sometimes during the summer, these long car trips all the way to Pittsburgh, so that we could still stay in touch with his family and really, our Black identity. And so that's another reason I dedicated the book to her.
Have you decided if you'll do another book? Is there another turning point, as you put it, in Black history out there waiting to be plumbed by Mark Whitaker?
There is. I'm already working on it. My next project. I'm not. I feel like I don't want to jinx it by talking about what it is,
there
but it will. It is. I will say that it is another kind of way that I am able. I hope I will be able to connect some dots about sort of what happened in Black America, both politically and also culturally, in the decades after the 60s.
Mark Whitaker, the author of Saying It Loud, 1966, the year Black Power challenged the civil rights movement. Thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Check out the book. Check out his Twitter profile at Mark T. Whitaker. I want to invite listeners again to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.